Good day, everybody. I hope that you are well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 3 English lesson on adjectives and adverbs. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once you've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English language arts. We're doing grade 3. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to our chapter of adjectives and adverbs. All right, so our chapter is adjectives and adverbs. Our subject is English language arts. We're doing grade 3. And the lessons that we are going to be focusing on under the chapter of adjectives and adverbs is to choose between adjectives and adverbs. And is the word an adjective or an adverb? So is the word an adjective or an adverb? All right. So when it comes to an adjective, right? An adjective is it's a word that tells you about the noun, or we can say it describes the noun, or we can even say it modifies the noun. So, firstly, a noun is a word that tells us about people, animals, places, or things. And an adjective, it is a word that tells us about that noun, meaning it tells us about that person, it tells us about that place, about that thing, about that animal, for example. And also, like we said, an adjective, it tells us more about the noun, it describes the noun, or we can say it modifies the noun. And some of the adjectives, not even some, and adjectives, they often tell us what kind, or they can tell us how many. So if the way it describes a noun or tells us about a noun, then they can tell us in the manner of what kind or how many. And if we look at an example, right, of an adjective, which is a word that tells us more about the noun, or we can say describes a noun, or we can say it modifies a noun. And when it comes to adjectives that tell us what kind or how many, then we can say, here's an example. It says Jody saw 3 stars in the sky in the sky. So Jody saw 3 stars in the sky. So which means that the word three, the word three, it tells us how many stars Jody saw. That is where it says adjectives tell us how many. So 3 tells us how many stars Jody saw. 3 stars. The girl had 2 dolls. The boys played with 5 cars. So these are all words that tells us how many of something or how many of the nouns someone or something has. We're doing adjectives and adverbs. And another example is even if we were to ask what kind, right? Then we can even say, I'll put it here. Jody can say Jody wears a red dress. So now the question is, what kind of dress is Jody wearing? So what kind of dress is Jody wearing? Because remember we said that an adjective tells us how many, and we, for example, made an example where we said 3, and here it now says what kind. Jody wears a red dress. What kind of dress is Jody wearing? So if we were to identify the adjective that tells us what kind, then we can say red. What kind usually tells us in the form of a color or size or something that describes the noun. All right. And then we have an adverb, right? And then an adverb is a word that tells us about a verb. So adverb tells us about a verb. And adverbs, right? They often tell you how, they tell you when, they tell you where. That's adjectives, adverbs that tell us about the verb. So adjectives they tell us about the noun, whereas adverbs it's a word that tells us about a verb. And adverbs it often tells us how something is being done, when something is being done, or where it is being done. And if we look at an example, right, of an adverb, it says Grace ran quickly. Grace ran quickly. And it says Grace ran quickly. So now the question is, what is the adverb? Firstly, the word ran is there. Ran is our verb. Now we need to either ask ourselves how Grace ran, and we can say quickly. So quickly tells us how Grace ran. And also when it comes to adverbs, right, then most of our adverbs, right, that tells us how. Like for example, here, quickly, it tells us how Grace ran. So most of our adverbs that tells us how, they end in ly. Quickly, hurriedly. Yes, so quickly is an adverb. So quickly is an adverb. And it's an adverb that tells us how something is being done. Remember, a verb is a doing word, right? Meaning it tells you how something is being done, or it tells you when something is being done, or it tells you where something is being done, meaning the action. And when we have an adjective that tells us, an adverb that tells us how something is being done, And then we need to, then our adverb ends with an ly. And when it comes to adverbs, right? You can't you can't always use ly to tell whether a word is an adjective or an adverb, because adverbs change. But that is why we just say when it comes to adverbs, it tells us how, and then it ends in ly. But adverbs can also be like that. They can tell you when, and they can tell you where something is happening, right? Or how it's being happened. Oh, yeah, when or where, right? And for example, an adverb that tells us maybe when or tells us where, it says she arrives soon. She arrives soon. She arrives soon. And soon is the adverb, right? That tells us when she will be arriving. When will she arrive? Soon. So soon is the adverb that tells us when she will be arriving. And as you can see, soon does not end with an ly. And sometimes by adding an ly to a word doesn't necessarily mean it is an adverb. Sometimes it can also be an adjective. So you need to be able to know if we are describing a verb or if we're describing a noun. For example, it says Fred has a friendly dog. So Fred has a friendly dog. So which means that this word friendly that ends in ly, this is an adjective because it describes the noun, which is the dog. All right. So basically, we are doing adjectives and adverbs once again. So friendly is an adjective because remember, dog is a noun. It's an animal. It's a noun. So it means that if we say friendly dog, and then it means that we are describing the dog. We are telling it's telling us more about the dog. It tells us what kind of dog we have. right? So you need to know the difference between an adjective and an adverb. And remember, an adjective, it tells us more about the noun. Adjectives, they tell us what kind, or they tell us how many. That is adjectives. And then we have adverbs, right? And adverbs, they tell us about a verb. Adverbs, they either tell us how something is being done, when something is being done, or they tell us where it is being done. And adjectives, they tell us how, they end in ly. For example, quickly, hurriedly, right? All right, so now we're going to aplusstudents.ca, and we're going to choose between an adjective and an adverb. And keeping in mind, adjectives that tell us about the noun, and adverbs tells us about a verb. So we are going to now insert the correct missing verb within the sentence, the verb. So we're saying Mrs. Garrison, we need to choose the correct word between brackets. Do we say careful lifted the glass or carefully lifted the glass? So we need to choose the correct missing verb. Do we say Mrs. Garrison careful lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf or carefully lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf? All right. And if we were to choose the correct answer, we can say Mrs. Garrison carefully lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf. So carefully. All right. So now let's go to our test, where we're going to choose between an adjective or we're going to choose between an adverb. All right. It says we need to insert the correct missing verb. The correct missing verb within the sentence. It says Mrs. Pittman. Do we say carefully? Option one, lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf. Or option two, careful, lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf. Which one is correct? Option one or option two? All right, and if we were to choose the correct missing verb within the sentence, then we will say Mrs. Pittman carefully lifted, because lifted is it's a verb, it's an action. The glass bowl onto the top shelf. Well done. Option one is correct. The next one says we need to select or insert the correct missing verb within that sentence. The verb within that sentence. Katie and Sandra, do we say neat, packed their clothes for the vacation in Arizona? Or do we say Katie and Sandra neatly packed their clothes for the vacation in Arizona? All right, so we can say Katie and Sandra neatly packed their clothes for their vacation. Well done, neatly. Will Mrs. Lee be driving to work at the usually time? Option one. Or at the usual time? Option two. Which one is correct? Usual time, usually time, option one, or usual time, option two. So will Mrs. Lee be driving to work at the usually time? or at the usual time. And if we were to choose the correct option, then we say the usual time. Well done. The next one says, my father's, do we say my father's fresh bread tasted delicious with the homemade soup? Or do we say option two, my father's freshly bread tasted delicious with the homemade soup? All right. And if we were to select the correct option, then we can say my father's fresh bread tasted delicious with the homemade soup. So fresh bread. Well done. Fresh is correct. Well done. The next one says the young child. Do we say the young child, option one, curiously watched his goldfish swimming in the bowl? Or the young child, option two, curious, watched his goldfish swimming in the bowl? And if we were to choose the correct option, we can say the young child curiously watched his goldfish swimming in the bowl. So curiously. The next one says Stacy and Janet smile. They smile. Do we say shy at the visitors? Or do we say shyly? Option two, at the visitors. Which one is correct? Stacy and Janet smile. Smile is an action that they do. Shy at the visitors or shyly at the visitors. And if we were to choose the correct option, we can say Stacy and Janet smile shyly at the visitors. Shyly. How do they smile? Shyly. All right. The next one says, do we say the eagerly fans look forward to the start of the baseball season? Or do we say option two, the eager fans look forward to the start of the baseball season? So the fans eagerly, or the eagerly fans, or the eager fans. We need to say which one is correct. Eagerly option one or eager option two. All right. And if we were to choose the correct option, and then we're going to say the eager fans, because your fans are your people, right? So the eager fans. And then the last one says, Mary, do we say usually runs several miles on the weekend? Or do we say Mary usual runs several miles on a weekend? And if we were to choose the correct option, then we would say Mary usually runs several miles on a weekend. All right, so that is the end of our lesson on adjectives and adverbs. We see that an adjective tells us more about a noun. It either tells us what kind or tells us how many. And then we have an adverb, and an adverb tells us more about the verb. It either tells us how, it tells us where, or it tells us when. And adverbs that tells us how, they end in ly. All right, so this is the end of our lesson on adjectives and adverbs. Thank you very much, grade threes, for joining the class. And I really hope that you're going to have a good weekend further. Goodbye.